All right, thank you and welcome to our first session of our local education agency representative webinar training and question and answer session. This session's focus is on free and appropriate public education and the definitions and guidance from NDE related to least restrictive environment and shortened day decisions. And I'm Dr. Pam Brzezinski, and I'm the ESU 13 Special Education Director. I do want all participants to know that we are recording this session, so please just know that if you do ask questions, to relate them to general terms and not student specific, because it will be shared with others after this training. So I welcome absolutely any and all questions throughout the training. Please feel free to interrupt me and make sure that we get everything answered. And if I can't answer anything at this moment, I will make sure to take notes and follow up with you. And if anyone that's watching this as a recorded webinar has a question, you can definitely direct that to pbrzezinski@esu13.org, and we will make sure to get you questions. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start. But the first thing that I'd like to note is that this document, I will share this document with all participants as well. But this presentation and document is meant to be a summary of the current guidance offered by Nebraska Department of Education. There won't be any personal opinions of anyone included in this. Everything that you will see on the screens has been taken directly or summarized from one of the Nebraska Department of Education guidance documents. Our sole purpose is to prepare this for you all for use to be able to guide you in your decisions through the IEP process. So the first topic that we want to address today is the concept of free, appropriate public education. This is actually a summary of the guidance from the shortened day document and the least restrictive environment document. But the things that we need to first address before we even discuss our least restrictive environment and shortened day is what FAPE truly is. So all students with an IEP are entitled to a free, appropriate public education. Remember way back to the passing of 504, and that is what established the Free and Appropriate Public Education Initiative. So notice that all students who are eligible for special education from 3 through 21 will fall under the guidance. All of this information can be found in your Rule 52 and Rule 51 guidance information. And Section 4.01 identifies FAPE is an individually determined element. And so it should vary from student to student, which makes sense because it's an individual education program. Then FAPE and LRE are closely connected. And so we have the least restrictive environment. And basically, students should receive the free and appropriate public education through the least restrictive environment. And so the least restrictive environment definition is that all students ages 3 through 21 should be educated with appropriate age peers, both with and without disabilities in an ideal setting. While we understand and will learn today about the continuum of services that could be noted within the least restrictive environment, we do want to just stress that the goal is for them to be educated with the age-appropriate peers, both with and without disabilities. We have to balance our settings and our services to make sure that all students get the services that they need to have access to a free and appropriate public education. This includes an array of services and a continuum of settings. And so as we move through today, we are going to talk about the array of services that could be provided, and we're going to address the continuum of educational setting options that are available within your educational setting. We have to remember that there's a strong background with least restrictive environment. And the key things, again, and you'll hear us say this multiple times today, is that children should be educated alongside their peers without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. And so the key words in there are to the maximum extent appropriate. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. We have to ensure that supplementary aids and services are provided to children, and we have to try those prior to moving to the next step in the continuum. And then we have that removal of a child with disabilities from the regular education class may occur only if the child cannot be satisfactorily educated. What that means is that data must be taken to identify if that is a satisfactory educational placement. We have to support all decisions in the free and appropriate public education and least restrictive environment with the use of data and documentation that we have tried every supplementary aid and service that may give them the best access to their education. And so knowing all of that information helps us move into the least restrictive environment guidance document provided by the Nebraska Department of Education. I really do enjoy this document. I think this document offers you some very good conversation points within meetings. It also helps teams determine what the least restrictive environment truly is for a child. And so as we move through this, we talk a little bit more. As I said, I'm going to go over it quite a few times, but we have to look at the background of the least restrictive environment. We have to know that there is a strong preference for the regular educational environment. So that means the access to core curriculum, that means the access to being in classrooms with peers and not being isolated is the law's strong preference. We have to identify wording and phrases within that provision. And it means that special classes, separate schooling, and removal from the educational environment need background and documentation and support to identify why that is happening. It is not to say that we cannot have a student be out of the regular educational environment. The point that the guidance document is making is that we have to follow a process and we have to make sure that we have tried everything to be open to getting the student the education in the regular environment to the best means possible. So we have a couple terms that we want to talk about because as we go through this today, we are going to see the term regular educational environment. So in your minds, you may have been thinking, well, what does that really mean? Well, the guidance document actually identifies it as the encompasses regular classrooms and other settings in the schools, such as lunchrooms and playgrounds in which children without disabilities participate. So a regular educational environment is any environment where students without disabilities will participate. And so our goal, remember, is to have to the best extent possible education in that regular environment. And the settings where students participate may vary. And so that is considered part of the regular educational environment. So we're going to have different settings and different locations that students will participate. So the term satisfactorily educated is also something that you will see. And there have been some legal elements that have come up due to a few cases, but we're going to talk about in terms of what the guidance document provides to us. And basically, there isn't a specific standard or level established within IDEA to determine what it means for a child to have achieved satisfactorily. So when we talk satisfactorily educated, we go back to the IEP and we use that as the child's measuring tool. We make sure that we look to what are the goals that were set for the child. Did we provide the least restrictive environment possible in order to reach those goals, which provided the student a free and appropriate public education? So the IEP team will determine if a child is appropriate, if their education is appropriate through a process. And we're going to see the process that NDE has provided. The IEP may be reviewed and revised as often as needed and as well as needed. And then if data supports changes, the team would say, that is not a satisfactorily educating environment. And so the team would have that. But the more data that you can provide and the more steps that you can provide, for example, through the MTSS process, would provide you that satisfactorily educated means. So we have to remember that necessary and appropriate adjustments or modifications should be made to those supplementary aids and services. They should not be put into place once a year and then only revisited that once a year. We should be monitoring that data as we move through the child's education. And so what the guidance documents offer to us is actually a very strong view of what a placement continuum is, because the guidance documents put into place some very effective visuals. And so when we talk about a placement continuum, the need for outside placements as determined by the IEP team is a continuum of alternative placements available to meet the needs of children with disabilities for special education and related services. So when we talk about a placement continuum, we are not talking that LRE is one setting or one environment. We are talking about a continuum of services that may go up and may go down as the child's needs dictate. So these placement options could include regular education classroom instruction. It could include special classes. That also could include your MTSS interventions, your interventions within a SAT process, or anything else that you may have. Special schools, which is an outside the school environment placement in many situations, home instruction, and instruction in hospitals or isolated institutional settings. But what we remember about all of this is that there is a continuum that we have to consider. So the IEP team determines all of this information. They determine the placement decisions. And then along with the child's parents, people who understand and know the placement options. An example of that might be if you have had somebody that has been working on interventions with the child and you know that they have the best knowledge, you may consider inviting them to that meeting to talk about placement. You have individuals who understand the significance of data and they can bring data to the table. So when we are making placement decisions, it is very important to include individuals who have this expertise or knowledge. And so it might be the school psychologist, it might be an interventionist, it might be an individual, a specialist, a provider, maybe that has worked with the child, like a speech language pathologist, an occupational therapist. It might even be a friend that maybe works with them at home. We have to remember that placement decisions should include those who know the child best. It typically may be the same group of people who are at your IEP meeting, but you may also invite others to join you because there may be individuals who know more about the placement of that child. Sometimes outside agencies may have a lot of information relating to a child. So the placement continuum found on page 8 of the guidance document, the LRE guidance document, walks you specifically through what is least restrictive and what is more restrictive. And so as you go through this particular document, this is probably one of the things I would really have you go to. Put your attention towards this because page 8 is really strong, where we want to start at this top of the IDEA continuum, and we want to educate the child in the least restrictive environment. That means that children should receive math instruction or reading instruction prior to going to a pull-out setting. So that's that continuum of services. So core instruction is critical for students. It's the least restrictive environment. Then we can put the continuum of placement elements above that as well. So we have to make sure we've tried that core instructional general education setting before we put any movement into isolated settings. That includes being educated with supplementary aids and services and the best supports possible. So I really like this chart. I think what's nice about this chart is that they have also provided us a birth to 3 continuum of services. And you'll notice that it is very different than the natural environments. It's almost kind of flipped on its side there for that one, because for birth to 3, the least restrictive environment is actually the natural environment. And that's why you will see a lot of students having services in daycares or in childcare facilities that they're in, because the natural environment is the least restrictive environment to that birth to 3 age group. They should, where they spend a good bulk of their time. That's why a lot of your EDN coordinators and the early service providers will go into the home. Now that's opposite of the 3 to school age, because being at home is actually one of the most restrictive environments. So it's really important to understand the differences between the birth to 3 least restrictive environment and the 3 to school age and the school age to 21. Because if we look at the difference between school age to 21 and the 3 to school age, we also include in 3 to school age the environment where the child spent time before being identified as a child with a disability. So that might be the community-based childcare facility, that might be the regular education setting if you have a preschool in your school environment. But then when we look at school age to 21, the least restrictive environment is the general education classroom. And then we look at special classes. So I'm going to give you an example to kind of walk you through how to use this. If a student is struggling and in their reading class, and they're shown by data and by assessment to be below their current grade level, we have to put supplementary aids and services in place first in the general education classroom. We have to provide those multi-tiered systems of support. We have to provide those interventions, and we have to provide all of those and document everything that is in that. Then we move to special classes if that student still is not getting an adequate instruction opportunity in that, because we want the student to have the least restrictive environment, but that balances the needs of the child and the growth and the significant impact that that education is having on them. So then we may educate them in reading outside of their room if they meet all of the criteria on the checklist that we will offer you today. Then the general education environment, if a child can be educated in that setting, we need to make sure that we keep them in that setting to the best extent possible. That is where our multi-tiered systems of support and our intervention systems come into place, because they are getting additional instruction beyond the core instruction. And I don't know if anybody has any questions about that, or if there are any thoughts about that. I would open it up at this time to have any discussion on that. Okay.
Pam?
Yes.
Is there and maybe you said it, I apologize if you did, is there a time frame in terms of, we've tried this at the core with these aids and these services and it's not working? Is there a time frame tied to that?
So I think there's going to be I can't say there's 100% time frame. Most people typically try 6 to 8 weeks. However, I don't know if there's the true time frame. I think it's going to vary by child, because the concern is if it's say that we're working on behavior and we are trying the supplementary aids and services, we have a functional behavior and a behavior intervention plan, we've done a functional behavior assessment, and maybe there's a safety security concern. And you'll see that in that progression that they ask us to follow. If there's a safety and security concern, we may have to limit that time for the student and for peers. So we'll walk through that. And I think that'll kind of help a little bit, because there are elements that allow you to move through that LRE continuum that you ask yourself those questions in the guide that's provided on page 9. And that kind of helps. So if you don't mind, we'll go there and then we'll see if that's answered through it. Any other thoughts or questions? That was a good question though, because I think a lot of people want a time frame. But remember that it's an individualized education plan and every child is so very different. So then we also look at the alternative placements, and that's where we come to special schools, home instruction, and institutional setting. A team can absolutely determine that the child cannot be educated satisfactorily in the regular education environment. A team could absolutely determine that, and we'll see a little more when we get to that checklist and that questioning process that this document provides. But what we have to remember is that we have to try all of those supplementary aids and services and supports before we can get to that. And so when we talk about that overall LRE continuum, it goes to kind of the question that Tessa asked. It has to be done on an individualized basis. So we can't say there's a time frame, or we have only this program, or we have only this. We have to make sure that we are individualizing the supplementary aids and service needs for each child. And that considers the unique needs of every child. So when you look at 46,586 federal component, we have to consider the unique needs of the circumstances rather than the disability category. So we cannot strictly say, well, all students that are verified in this particular category receive this service, or all students that are verified in this category are placed in this environment. We cannot unequivocally say that. It has to be based on the unique needs of every single child. And we have to have a mindset that placement isn't an either or decision. It's not a this or this, it's a what's in the middle and how can we support them. And if the intent is for services to follow or go with the child, not for the child to follow the services. And I think that's the big thing to remember, is that least restrictive environment is not a place, it's a set and continuum of services. And a child should move up the continuum, down the continuum. If they are moving down the continuum into a lesser restrictive environment, we have to employ strategies and work to get them back to the least restrictive and go back to the gen ed setting. Gen ed should always be the goal. Now, granted, it doesn't always happen because of certain circumstances, right? The unique needs of the children. But we have to remember that the least restrictive environment is required by federal law. All of these components that are in this guidance document are guided by federal law. And we have to make sure that we consider a full array of services for every single student. Now, we do live in a rural environment, and we have schools that have different arrays of services. And so it is possible that your school doesn't offer that service at this moment, but that doesn't mean we can't build it and create it and support it. And so sometimes we have to think about that array of services of what can we do to meet the needs of the child? What can we do best to do that? And we have to think of placement of the students of disabilities with peers of the same chronological age. So we have to remember that even if a student with a disability who maybe speaks a different language moves into our school, we cannot place them in a lower setting because we feel that their language is of that level. It's just like the disability, just because they maybe progress at a 2nd or 3rd grade level and they're supposed to be a 5th grader, we cannot put them back in that 2nd or 3rd grade classroom. So we have to remember that we place them with students with disabilities with peers of the same chronological age, not cognitive age. So that's a very important point when considering your least restrictive environment. We have to provide access to all areas of the general education curriculum. And just maybe because a student is showing a cognitive progression in reading at a second grade level does not mean that we should not give them access to the core material and the core vocabulary. We have to make sure that they have access to the general education curriculum. And remember, we said regular education environment, we gave that definition. That's what we have to give that general education curriculum. So then LRE is not, and I think they were quite direct on this with their, on page 9, you can read it yourself there at the bottom, but it is, LRE is not an option. It is something that we have to have. It is not educating students with disabilities without considering their home school. It is not considering only one placement option within an array of services and saying, this is all we have. This is all we offer. We can create those arrays. And that's why we're here at ESU 13, is to help you be creative, to help you build systems, to help you have an array of services. And it is not making IEP teams choose between needed services and preferred appropriate placement. It is also not putting students in general education classrooms without appropriate support. And just because we say they need to be in a regular education environment doesn't mean we just say, okay, they're going to be in there. But remember, it goes back to that substantial, the equity and the substantial gain and is it actually making an impact on that child? That's the big question. So if we provide a separate unrelated curriculum we don't provide them a separate unrelated curriculum than their general education peers. So the core curriculum, I think you've probably gotten that strain from this guidance document throughout, that it's the general education curriculum. They need to be educated in the general education environment. And the important thing to remember is that we don't make placement decisions on needs or available resources. We cannot include budgetary considerations in the ability of the school system to hire and recruit qualified staff. And I know that's difficult. This one is difficult to address, but placement decisions cannot solely be based on this. We cannot provide the data that says this is why the student is going to be placed in a separate environment. Any questions on that? Because I know that statement right there can be difficult. Any questions on that statement? Okay. So when we think about how do we determine LRE, this comes right from page 9, and this is probably one of my favorite. I guess I'm odd because I have a favorite visual and process list that that NDE has developed in the last couple of years, and this one is mine. Because if we work through a situation, and I'm going to give you guys an example, and we're going to work through what the Department of Ed provides. So section 1 is whether education can be achieved satisfactorily in the regular classroom for a major portion of the school day with the use of supplementary aids and services. So if we have a student who has significant behaviors in a classroom, we have to ask ourselves the first question, which is steps taken by the school to try to include the child in a regular classroom in conjunction with supplementary aids and services. So they give us guiding questions to be able to ask ourselves and our team. Has the school considered the whole range of supplementary aids and services, including resource rooms and itinerant instruction? So teams would either mark yes or they would mark no. But the thing I want to tell you is we're going to get into supplementary aids and services in just a second. So if you're confused with that factor, we will make sure to cover that. All right. The second question is, has the school made efforts to modify the regular? I'm going to make sure I did not. Has the school made efforts to modify the regular program to accommodate the child? So we have to think about significant efforts. Have we put supplementary aids and services in place? And have we put efforts in to modify the regular program to accommodate the child? That may be, did we put a paraprofessional in the room or support? Have we given them instruction in the 5-point scale? Have we given them all of those things? If we've done multiple data sets and we have that information, we say yes or no. Then we look at, do the school's efforts constitute a least serious consideration rather than token gestures? Now, this one is hard. And this one is kind of a little searching of, have we done this as a token gesture, or have we actually put really strong practices and evidence-based practices into place? And so this is where a lot of your intervention data and your MTSS data come into play, because have you done these things? Do you have things documented that will be able to support that? Then the second question set we ask ourselves is comparison between the educational benefits in the segregated setting versus those in a regular classroom with supplementary aids and services. So does the comparison significantly include social and communication skills as well as academic progress? So sometimes maybe with that student with behavior that we're talking about and using as our example, maybe they are nonverbal, and we know that the receptive language is what maybe is impeding them and they just don't understand. So does the comparison significantly include social and communication skills as well as academic progress? Did you consider all those other things? Did we consider the social skills curriculum? Is the student receiving enough social skill instruction to be able to improve their behavior? So think about those things and check yes or no. And then with such a broad scope, would education experts favor the segregated placement in terms of relative benefits to the individual child? So at times it is possible that maybe a student is so significantly behind their peers that there isn't a benefit achieved by being in the classroom for specific courses. And at that point, we have to think, would education experts feel that that's something that we could do to move that student forward? Are we actually moving them forward? And that's the big question you want to ask yourself. And then the third thing is, are there possible negative effects on the education of other children in the regular classroom if the child were integrated with appropriate supplementary aids and services? Notice that each of these steps has appropriate supplementary aids and services. Is there a negative effect so disruptive that the education of the other students is significantly impaired? This requires a great deal of data. How much education time is being lost for peers? How much education time is being lost for the student who maybe has the behaviors? Or maybe how much education time is actually being lost for the student who maybe isn't following the reading instruction or anything like that? Do the child's disabilities demand so much of the teacher's time that the teacher will be required to ignore the other students? And so those are questions that as a team, it is important to discuss. It can be touchy when we have everybody at the table, but it is very important to discuss. Then you'll notice that at the very bottom, it says if most of the answers to questions in section 1A to 1C are yes, a segregated placement may be appropriate. If you have tried every option, then you may consider a segregated placement. In that case, the proposed segregated placement should be evaluated with the questions in section 2. So say that we've said, yes, we've tried all of these things. The student isn't making significant progress. We aren't able to put interventions in place and supplementary aids and services that are helping the student. So we're saying that maybe a segregated classroom is the best option for them. So then we look at determining if a proposed placement includes the child in the school programs with non-disabled children to the maximum extent appropriate. So we look at, is it possible to place the child in regular education for some, even if not a significant portion of academic programs? So maybe they are doing very well in science and social studies, and our student we're using as our example is doing very well in PE, they're doing very well in music, but it's math and reading. So maybe we educate them outside of that classroom if we've checked yes for everything and we've tried everything, but we still have them with their general education peers if at all possible, because that's where they're successful. Then we ask ourselves, is it possible to place the child in a regular non-academic class? Are there other classes and instructional opportunities that are available for the student? So if our student maybe with behaviors is in high school, are there work-based learning classes where that student might feel better? Are there shop classes? Are there family consumer science classes? Are there things that the student may fit into in a better way? Have we planned their curriculum in the way that is going to be effective for them? And is it possible to provide interaction with non-disabled children during lunch and recess? That's a big question, right? Even if we have them in an isolated setting within our building, could they still have lunch and recess? So we kind of walk through that continuum. Any questions about that process or that think through? I kind of call it a think through process. Okay. So when we talk supplementary aids and services, because I think I maybe said that word about 20 times in this guidance document preview, but what it means is aids, services, and other supports that are provided in that regular education setting. What did we put into place? It enables the child to be educated and to access the curriculum. It goes back to that free and appropriate public education. Are they educated to the maximum extent appropriate? So if a student, our example of our student, the student has some receptive language concerns, right? They don't understand the language that maybe the teacher is using and the peers are using, and it gets overwhelming because it kind of jumbles and makes them overwhelmed. Are we giving them some assistive technology that can support that? Are we having a paraprofessional that can give them the commands and the steps that are necessary in smaller language? Are we using visual aids and supports? Are we using everything that we should be using to make sure that they can access the language of that classroom? And it provides students with extra, so an example might be that it provides students with extra time to take tests or complete assignments, giving shorter or different assignments, providing feedback more frequently than other children. So using that 5 to 1, 5 positive to 1 negative. But it has to be documented. And that's why if we're using a strong intervention process and an MTSS process, we have documentation in every step that we're doing. As long as we have good, strong systems in place and we make sure that we've put those things in place, we have documentation. And then are we providing physical adaptations if necessary? So in the case of this student being able to bring that information in and process that, did we put assistive technology in place or support in place that will help them to access that information? And here's just a few more. You guys will get the presentation, but they can be accommodations. They can be modifications. They can be the manner in which things are presented. Maybe we have things visually, maybe we have things verbally, maybe we have things that are given recorded and so they have it later. Maybe we give them skeleton notes because their processing speed is not as fast as what we have. The way in which the progress is measured. So maybe we're measuring progress in a totally different way. Maybe they don't do well with a computerized test, so we are using a one-on-one kind of red system for them. However, we need to do it to make sure that it meets their unique abilities is what we need to do. And our whole goal with supplementary aids and services is that we provide them all of the opportunities in the regular education class that they need to be successful. They have everything they need. They have resources. They have supports. They have everything that the intent is to help integrate children with disabilities and put them into the regular education setting as noted in the definition within the guidance document. And remember that the school system is responsible for providing those supplementary aids and services that the IEP team determines the child needs. But going back a few slides, it cannot be based on budgetary restrictions and cannot be determined based on staffing needs. So if a child needs it, the school is responsible as long as it's in the IEP. Are there any questions about supplementary aids and services? Okay. So parental options, just a few things here. We don't have a lot here because we've talked a lot about how the parent must be a part of the team. The parent must be a part of the decision of the least restrictive environment. Can a parent disagree with the school? Absolutely. And there's a whole due process in place for that. But the schools must provide the parents, even if they were in that meeting, with a prior written notice that identifies what will be taking place. Then we have that needs to be, and this is the key part that I think is incredibly important out of this section of the guidance doc, that it needs to be, the prior written notice must be written in language understandable to the general public and in the parent's native language. We have to remember that it has to be given to them in the manner in which they communicate. If we have a parent who does not read, we can call them or walk them through it, and we can make sure that they fully understand. We could even possibly have a link to a recording of that. But we have to make sure that that parent has access to that information, because it really isn't transferred in communication if that parent cannot read the prior written notice that is sent home. And I love the part in here about understandable to the general public, because sometimes we use a lot of education speak and we don't use terminology that the general public could understand. So it is very important to make sure that it is understandable information. And the prior written notice must include the educational placement that you are initiating. It must include how you got there and the data. And so in that prior written notice, all data, assessments, records, any reports or anything that were used must be listed, a description of other options considered and why these were rejected. This is very important because if we're talking about a continuum and we walked through that process, that's why this guidance document and that that talking guide, you could say we used the Nebraska Department of Education Least Restrictive Environment talking guide and walked through all of those. You could upload it, you could do whatever you needed, but as long as you followed that process, you were able to say why things were rejected. And then a statement that the parents have protection under IDEA's procedural safeguards and the means by which those safeguards are put into place, which that's actually a written component at the bottom for you. And then sources that can help the parents understand IDEA. That is actually all itemized down in the form, but you just have to make sure to provide data and support for that. Remember that if a parent does not agree with the school, because the decision for the least restrictive environment is a team decision. It isn't one person on the team's decision. And so if someone does not agree, then they can go through a mediation and a due process procedure. So keep in mind that they can write a dissenting letter, they can identify why they don't agree with the team and why that placement is not something that they wish to have. They could technically file a state complaint if they are not in agreement. And keep in mind that these are all noted in the guidance document. There are a few early childhood considerations that we want to bring your attention to. We want to talk a little bit. You'll see in that continuum of services that you have some early childhood components in there, but a lot of the information comes from the Dear Colleague letter in January of 2017, where we have to remember that the LEA may provide special education and related services to a preschool child with a disability in a variety of settings. So this could include a regular kindergarten class, public or private preschool program, community-based childcare facility, and in the child's home. So there are a lot of settings in which early childhood services could take place. But we have to remember that they're identified as children with disabilities while participating in a regular public preschool program, such as Head Start or regular public pre-kindergarten program. So there could be students who work in a public setting, but maybe that student doesn't do well in that public setting and you decide to move them to a different setting. So even though that continuum is there, remember that the Dear Colleague letter identifies that the continuum of placement and what the team determines may look very different for every child. And we have to remember that the first placement option considered for a preschool child with a disability is the regular public preschool program. We want to make sure that that is our first decision. Now, sometimes we don't have that and we may look to neighboring districts. We may look to other locations. We may look in any other setting. But they have to receive all of the special education and related services and supplementary aids and services included in that IEP that are identified. So early childhood placement of continuum is still the exact same. That least restrictive environment is that they really need to be educated with their peers when possible. And before removing a child, so we may have a child who needs to be removed from our current regular public preschool because we've identified all of those talk through points that identify, yes, 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 we've tried absolutely everything. And so it may actually move them to a more restrictive environment. The district must consider if the child already participates in a regular public preschool program, if the child is educated in the school that he or she would attend if non-disabled. That's the goal. The goal is for that. And any potential harmful effects that could come from the child being removed from that setting. And so those are a few of the early childhood considerations for least restrictive environment. Basically, all of the information that we provided on least restrictive environment can be found in the Nebraska Department of Education guidance document that is linked above for least restrictive environment. Any questions on least restrictive environment? Tessa, are there any things you'd like to mention for MTSS or any words that you would like to place in there?
I don't think so at this time.
Okay, thank you. And so then we talk a little bit when you saw that the general education classroom for the entire school day, being educated with peers, is the least restrictive environment. But there are times where teams may determine that an alternative placement, such as a shortened day, might be the best placement for a child. And so the Nebraska Department of Education offered special education guidance in September of 2017 on shortened day. And so what we're going to define as a shortened day is that students with disabilities must attend for the same number of hours and minutes as non-disabled students, unless the IEP team determines otherwise based on the student's unique disability-related needs. The key thing to remember there is the same number of hours and minutes. A lot of people, if students attend an alternative placement, will say, okay, well, their hours are going to be 9 to 3, but our school is 8 to 3. That's actually a shortened day. However, if they're being transported during that time, they are in the educational process. If the education is taking place in the vehicle as well, if social education, if transportation education, if all of those things are being provided, then that student is actually receiving those at that moment. So then the biggest thing we have to remember is that it's based on the unique disability related needs. So we wouldn't want to say, well, every student who has a behavior should have a half day. We can't unequivocally say that, right? Because we looked at that talk through statement. We talked about that for unique needs for every child. So shortened day looks differently for every single student who receives a shortened day. Any questions about that information? Okay, so the legal considerations that we have to remember is that shortened day brings up concerns with the provision of free and appropriate public education. Because if general education peers get 8 hours of free appropriate public education every day, and a student only receives 4 hours of free appropriate public, our special education student receives 4 hours, we have a disconnect, and it raises an issue regarding the provision of FAPE. So we have to make sure that we are documenting why we followed that LRE process, that talk through document, because if we don't, we have potential discrimination under the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, because we are discriminating and not providing equal access to our student with a disability. We have to remember that it should be for a specific purpose and designed to meet the student's unique needs. That is why data is so important. And especially when we're considering social, emotional, behavioral learning in the MTSS process, we have to take our data and we have to know what supplementary aid services and instruction were provided to the student, because this is the piece that we want to be cautious about here, is that we're not essentially creating a discriminatory environment. So just like and now I did find this picture, I will tell you, I found this picture outside of the NDE document, but I wanted a visual to kind of explain this again and put it into place. So when we talk about the continuum of services and placement, remember that we had our least restrictive, most restrictive, right? But we put shortened day kind of in between here and homebound, right? So when a student receives shortened day, we are essentially moving from the least restrictive environment of general education setting or special education classroom to a more restrictive environment. So we want to make sure that we have tried all alternatives to a shortened day, because if we jump from a general education classroom to a homebound placement and shortened day and cut this all, did we try half of a day in general education and half of a day in the special education classroom? Did we follow that least restrictive continuum, as opposed to just saying, well, they can only handle 3 hours today, this is all we're going to do? Did we try other environments, or do we have a plan to come back to the least restrictive environment? So remember that least restrictive environment matters when we're talking about a shortened day. So our key considerations when we bring up the issue of a shortened day are free and appropriate public education and the possible discrimination under 504, and least restrictive environment changes and going from a least restrictive environment to a more restrictive environment. We impact compulsory attendance and the length of the school day. We have appropriate uses of a shortened day consideration that must come in, and we have inappropriate uses of a shortened day that we're going to consider, and then we have some questions. So the appropriate use of a shortened day is that the only time it is appropriate is when the student's IEP team determines that it is required to address a student's unique disability-related needs. If we, for example, and I'm not saying this is the only case, but for example, if we have a student who has significant health concerns and they have some fatigue that happens after 3-4 hours of being in school, they might not physically have any benefit if they are in the classroom anymore because they're so tired, or they need to nap, or they need to do something. So if we have a student with a significant disability, if we have somebody who has significant emotional concerns, and they can't work through an entire day, we may consider the use of a shortened day. But before deciding that, we have to make sure that we've looked at all other options on that continuum. And if, because of the student's medical needs, the student is physically unable to tolerate it, it may be appropriate if we go through that process. If you think back to that talk through and all of those things we might say yes at, if we've tried all the supplementary aids and services, if we've tried even the nurse's station and maybe a time for rest, and things still aren't going well, then we may consider that shortened day. But we have to put thought into that to meet the student's unique needs. When a student's school day is shortened, the student's IEP must include an explanation of why the student's disability-related needs shorten the day. You have to have documentation, and you have to have data and support to show what you've tried, what works, maybe why they're going to that shortened day schedule. And then this is the very important part of this guidance document that I want everybody to remember about a shortened day. All shortened day decisions must include a plan for the student's return to full-time educational setting. So that plan should be discussed by the team, and everyone should have an idea of what they need to be working on. And everybody at that team is going to have a part in making sure that that student has opportunity to be successful in the plan for a safe return to a full day. So that's an important point to remember about that. The return provision should show that they will return to a full school day as soon as possible. So we have to have it as soon as possible, or as the student is able. Now, the shortened day should be placed in most cases only for a limited amount of time. It shouldn't be that the student is in maybe 4th grade and then they are going to be on a shortened day until the end of high school. So it is a very limited setting, and we are going to work with supplementary aid services and instruction to make sure that that student gets back to the full-time setting. The IEP team must meet as often as necessary to review the plan. So it might require additional meetings to make sure that you are following the plan steps and that you are going in the process that is needed. Any question about that? Because I know that that often provides some confusion for people. We have to have, I'm going to provide some examples of brief specific purpose shortened days that may, and this comes from the guidance document, these examples do, that may not result in less than Fape and in an LRE. So maybe you have a student with a recent brain trauma and they're currently in recovery and they need a reduced day to help with cognitive fatigue associated with recovery. So that might be an example of a shortened day. Often you're going to get a return to learn plan with that. You're going to have all of those things, and your IEP team will consider all of those to develop their plan to get that student back to a full day. You might have a physician of a student who has new seizure medication, and they're really worried about them going the whole day because they don't know what the result is going to be. And so that might be an example where you create a plan of, okay, well, we're going to try this for a month and then we're going to add an hour. We're going to try this for another month and then we'll add another hour. And then we'll have the doctor report and see how that's going. Then another example might be a recently adopted student from another country is experiencing transitional difficulties. Parents and the therapist may request a gradual transition to school. And so there are times, we're not saying that you cannot have shortened day. There are times when a shortened day is necessary for that student and that everybody on the team feels that that student needs a shortened day. So we're not saying that they don't exist. I just want to go back to this because it's so important. The point is, though, we have to know why, we have to have data to support why, and then we have to have a plan for their safe return. So an example that the document offers of inappropriate use of a shortened day might be to manage student behavior as a means of discipline. So if we have students who maybe are very aggressive in the classroom, or maybe they are just not following rules or they're not following things, we cannot use a shortened day to manage the behavior. We have to make sure that we have those supplementary aids and services in place, like a behavior intervention plan or other means to be able to instruct them on how to handle this dysregulation and sensory needs. So at least an LEA may not reduce a student's instructional time as a form of punishment or in lieu of a suspension or expulsion. So just because a student maybe had a significant behavior where they struck another child, we cannot use a shortened day as a punishment in that. Attendance may also not be solely conditioned upon the students taking medications or receiving treatment, therapies, or other outside services. So an example of that might be, I know one that has come up lately is if maybe an ABA therapist is asking if they could do a quarter of a day of ABA therapy, and the student would leave to go receive that therapy. That is actually not a means of managing that. So we have to remember that we could invite people in to do those activities, but that is not a means of adding a shortened day. The IEP team must develop an IEP that addresses the student's behavioral needs. So we have to remember that it isn't a means to get the behavior in control of students. We cannot use a shortened day to accommodate transportation schedules. A LEA may not reduce the student's instructional time by starting the student's school day later and releasing the student earlier than non-disabled peers, because maybe they're doing a bus route first, and then they're going to transport a child to an alternative setting after that happens. That cannot be reduced, and that shortened day cannot happen as a result of accommodating transportation schedules. So it is not permissible for a school to release students with disabilities earlier than their non-disabled peers as well. Now, if it's put in there as part of the behavior intervention plan that the student gets overwhelmed by the large amount of students exiting the building, then we would make sure that that's part of the behavior intervention plan. That's not a shortened day. That's part of following the IEP, and that's a supplementary aid and service. So if an LEA has permitted such actions up to this point, the guidance document notes that they should take immediate steps to correct the resulting denial of an equal opportunity and FAPE. So just note that take immediate steps as soon as possible as you identify any of these concerns that might exist, and just have meetings and have them rectified. Any questions on that? Because that one I know provides a lot of stress and confusion. Okay. And C, it cannot be a shortened day because of administrative convenience. So if say that you have a student who maybe has some significant behaviors or has some really, really heavy needs, and you have a teacher who maybe is out on a medical leave for a couple weeks, we cannot call a parent and say, the student is only going to come for the first 3 hours of school because teacher A is out for 2 weeks. So we have to remember that a shortened day cannot exist because of administrative convenience. And it cannot be made to accommodate regularly scheduled outside therapies. So that kind of goes back to that ABA example as well. We cannot shorten a student's day to have scheduled non-school medical or therapeutic appointments put into their day. If they are in need of that within a certain hour of the school system, that's where we may want to consider as an IEP team the adding of it to the IEP, if that's something they absolutely have to have within the school day. But that would be because they absolutely need it. But we shouldn't use a shortened day to accommodate those regularly scheduled outside therapies. Parents and schools should communicate regarding absences and why those exist. And when absences are frequent, the IEP team should meet to determine how to ensure the continued provision of FAPE. So if that is happening, and say that the parent says the only time I can get them to this location is 2 days a week at this time, they're going to miss 2 days of school, maybe there's a different way to make up that free and appropriate public education. So we just have to remember schools must refer to their local attendance and excusal policies to determine whether absences are excused. So that is something to consider when a student is on an IEP. We cannot shorten a day upon parent request. If a parent requests to change the length of the student's day, the response, the LEA must respond to the parent's request. Schools must refer to their local attendance and excusal policies to determine whether absences are excused. So what it is essentially saying is that you could technically say, okay, well, you could go to that appointment on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but those might be unexcused. Or you could excuse them because they're doctor appointments. So it really just depends on your local attendance and excusal policies based on how you will move forward with these types of requests. And if it's going to be an ongoing thing, any changes to the regular school schedule must be made to the student's IEP. And we're not talking for doctor's appointments that come up every now and then. These are just for things that might actually impact their school schedule. And if it is required to meet their unique disability related needs, that is where that would actually come into play as it's an acceptable use. And we cannot have it as a standard for all students with disabilities or a group of disabilities. So we cannot say that all students with behavior must be on a shortened day. And then the guidance document actually asks you or offers you some procedural questions. And I'm not going to go through these so that you can actually answer your own question and answer. You can ask your own questions on anything that you heard today. But if you look at that guidance document, and you will get the links to those and the link to this presentation after the presentation. But basically, they've provided a lot of really good question and answer components within the guidance documents recently. And so you'll hear a lot of really good questions and the state answers them in the documents. So please review those. And then if you have questions at all, it gives you just very clear answers to how to move through. And just remember, there are specific things in place for students who are taking high school courses and earning credits towards graduation. So the team cannot solely rely upon whether a student has completed credits or coursework for graduation. They have to consider that whether the student is prepared for further education, employment, or independent living. So this is if, say that you have a student who maybe is 18 to 21 and they are working 2 days a week. You could technically count that work time if the school is involved as a school-based, if they have a job coach, because that is something that is a part of a shortened day because that 18 to 21 student is working on their goal. Their goal is to have a job after they leave high school. So that would be an acceptable use of a shortened day, but if the school has any interaction in that and provides a job coach, then that actually counts as educational time. But if they spend maybe time at an agency like the OHD office, or they have ILC support or something, and they're furthering their goals, that's an acceptable use of the day. So those are a few examples of why it's just a little different than the traditional school setting. All right, so that is all of the information on those two guidance documents that I have for you guys today. I don't know if anyone wants to put any more information in there on how things connect or have questions. If you have anything that kind of shocked you today, or you have questions that you would like a follow-up, please let me know. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you all for attending our first session. As I said, this was recorded and I will get that downloaded, and then we will be able to send you the link to that along with the links to the two guidance documents that we discussed today. And then if you have any questions, please email me. And if I cannot answer them, I will go directly to the source and I will contact someone at NDE and find out those answers for you. So please just let me know how we can help you and support the least restrictive environment and the use of a shortened day. Thank you. And I'm going to